There is a specific kind of grief that the world gives you permission to feel when your husband dies. People bring food to your door. They sit with you. They say his name out loud so you know they remember him. They check on you at the 1-month mark and the 6-month mark and the first anniversary of the day you got the call. They give you time off work and they lower their voices when they talk about him, and they treat you with the particular tenderness that the world reserves for people who have lost someone to something that was nobody's fault. A car accident. A sudden cardiac event. A body pulled from a river. The world is very good at surrounding a widow with care. What the world does not prepare you for. What there is no casserole dish and no condolence card and no grief support group designed to address is the moment 4 years after the funeral when you are standing in a grocery store in a city 400 miles from the one where you buried an empty coffin, and you look up from the cereal aisle and you see your dead husband standing in the bread aisle reading the back of a loaf of sourdough. Welcome to Venom Thread, where the truth is darker than fiction. And tonight the story we are telling does not have a word in the English language adequate to describe what one woman discovered and what she did about it. Her name was Diana, and Diana had been, by every measure that the world applies to such things, a devoted wife. She had met a man named Callum at 28 years old at a work conference in a hotel bar in a city neither of them lived in, and she had felt within 20 minutes of conversation that specific click of recognition that most people spend their whole lives either waiting for or telling themselves they have already found. Callum was tall and quietly funny, and he listened in the way that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who announced himself when he walked into a room. He was the kind of man who was already in the room when you arrived, and somehow by the end of the night, you could not imagine the room without him. They were married inside 2 years. They bought a house in the 3rd year. They built the specific architecture of a shared life, the routines, the in-jokes, the shorthand that develops between two people who have decided to become each other's primary witness. Diana thought she knew exactly who she had married. She thought she knew this the way you know things you have tested repeatedly and found to be true every single time. She was wrong in a way so complete that even now, having lived the whole story, she says she has not found a framework that fully contains it. The marriage was 7 years old when Callum died, or when Callum appeared to die. The distinction matters enormously, and it is the entire story, so let us be precise about it. He died on a Tuesday in November on a stretch of highway outside the city where they lived. His car was found at the bottom of an embankment. The vehicle was destroyed. There was blood consistent with his type at the scene. There was no body. The river that ran alongside that section of highway was fast and cold, and the current was significant, and the search lasted 11 days before it was officially suspended. The absence of a body was explained. It was not unusual. The paperwork was filed. The death certificate was issued. The funeral was held with a closed casket and a great deal of flowers, and Diana sat in the front row and received the condolences of everyone who had known them as a couple, and she felt a grief so total and so physically present that she could not eat for 9 days and could not sleep for longer than 2 hours at a stretch for 6 weeks after. She was not performing her grief. She was not exaggerating it. She was a woman who believed with complete certainty that her husband was dead, and she was grieving him with everything she had, because she had loved him with everything she had, and that is what love costs you when it is taken without warning. What Diana did not know, what it would take 4 more years in a sourdough loaf in a grocery store in a city she had moved to specifically to start over to discover, was that Callum had not died on that Tuesday in November. He had planned. He had prepared. He had staged the evidence at the scene with a level of premeditation that would later be described by the detective who reviewed the case as one of the most methodically constructed frauds she had ever seen outside of a professional operation. The blood at the scene was his own, collected over several weeks prior in small quantities and stored. The car going over the embankment was deliberate and timed. The river current was something he had studied. He had a bag waiting. He had a new identity in partial preparation. He had a plan for a life that did not include Diana, did not include their house, did not include the 7 years they had built together, and did not include the truth. He simply walked away from all of it and let the world, let Diana, believe that the alternative was death. Because death was cleaner than the conversation he did not want to have. Because death required nothing from him. Because death, staged correctly, is the most complete exit available to a person who has decided they are done but lacks either the courage or the decency to say so. Diana spent the first year after Callum's death doing what surviving spouses do. She sorted through his things. She closed his accounts. She dealt with the insurance, a policy that paid out a sum significant enough to have represented, she would later understand, part of his calculation. Because he had taken out a second policy 18 months before his disappearance that she had not known existed, and that paid out to a separate account that she also had not known existed, and that was empty by the time the fraud was uncovered because the money had been moved systematically over the 4 years he was gone. She sold the house at the end of year 1 because she could not continue to live inside the physical shape of their life together. She moved to a new city. She rebuilt. She made new friends who had not known Callum and did not lower their voices around her and treated her like a person rather than a tragedy. She went back to work full-time. She adopted a dog. She began, slowly and with great effort, and with the particular determination of someone who has decided that grief will not be the last chapter, to construct a life that was entirely her own. By year 4 she had done it. Not perfectly and not without cost, but she had done it. She was stable. She was almost okay. And then she went to buy sourdough bread. She saw him before he saw her. That detail matters because it is the detail that gave her the 4 seconds she needed to make the decision that would define everything that came after. For seconds in which she confirmed with absolute certainty that the man in the bread aisle was her husband. The height was the same. The way he held his shoulders was the same. The particular way he tilted his head to read something was so specific and so familiar that her body recognized it before her mind had fully processed the implication of what she was seeing. For seconds in which she felt, in rapid succession, a wave of something that was not quite any single emotion, but contained elements of shock and grief and fury, and a cold, clarifying anger that she later described as the feeling of every confused and painful thing from the past 4 years suddenly making a horrible and complete sense. And in those 4 seconds, she made a decision. She did not approach him. She did not call his name. She did not take out her phone and call anyone. She turned and she walked to a different aisle, and she stood very still for approximately 90 seconds, and she made a plan. She left the store. She sat in her car in the parking lot, and she waited. 22 minutes later, Callum walked out of the store carrying 2 bags. She watched him walk to a car she had never seen, put the bags in the trunk, get in the driver's seat, and pull out of the parking lot. She followed him at a distance that she later described as calm and deliberate. She was not shaking. She was not crying. She said she felt something that she could only call the opposite of grief, a clarity so sharp and so cold that it burned. She followed him to a house in a residential neighborhood 12 minutes from the grocery store. She noted the address. She noted the make and model and license plate of the car. She drove home. She sat down at her kitchen table, and she opened her laptop, not to search his name, not to look up his new address on a map. She opened her laptop and she typed the name and phone number of a private investigator she had used 2 years earlier for an unrelated matter, and she sent him an email that said 4 words. I need your help. What the investigator found over the following 3 weeks built a picture so complete and so deliberate that it removed any remaining possibility that what Callum had done was the result of a breakdown or a crisis or a moment of catastrophic poor judgment from which he had never recovered. He had been living under a slightly modified version of his own name, a middle name used as a first name, a maternal surname substituted for his own, in the same city for 3 years, having moved there after an initial period elsewhere, while he established the new identity. He had a job. He had a social life. He had a girlfriend who had been with him for 2 years, and who knew him as a man who had been through some difficult years after a period of personal crisis, but who was doing well now. He had told her that he had no family. He had told her that his past was something he was working through in therapy and preferred not to discuss in detail. He had constructed a new life with the same methodical patience he had applied to dismantling the old one. And the old one, Diana's life, the one he had walked away from, the one he had faked to death rather than exit honestly, had never been contacted, never been checked on, never been given a single moment of consideration in the 4 years since he drove his car into a river and walked away from everything it meant. Diana did not go to the police first. This is the part of her story that tells you everything about who she is and what kind of intelligence she brought to a situation that would have caused most people to act immediately from emotion and thereby lose every advantage the element of surprise had given them. She went to a lawyer first, a specialist in fraud, insurance crime, and civil litigation who also had a background in cases involving staged deaths, a category of legal specialty that is rarer than you might think, but exists because Callum was not the first person to make this particular calculation and will not be the last. She laid out everything the investigator had found. She presented the documentation. She presented the timeline. She presented the insurance policy she had not known about and the account it had paid into and the forensic accounting trail that showed where the money had gone. The lawyer looked at everything for a long time and then said, "You have one of the clearest cases of insurance fraud, identity fraud, and deliberate abandonment I have seen in 15 years of practice. The question is not whether you have a case. The question is what outcome you want and which path gets you there most completely." Diana was specific about the outcome she wanted. She did not want a confrontation. She did not want an explanation. She did not want an apology from a man who had demonstrated over a 4-year period of sustained silence that he was not capable of genuine remorse for what he had done to her. What she wanted was accountability of the kind that would follow him regardless of where he went next or who he told his story to or how many new versions of himself he attempted to construct in whatever city he moved to after this one. She wanted the record corrected. She wanted every institution that had been deceived to know it had been deceived. She wanted the insurance company that had paid out on a fraudulent death claim to have the information it needed to pursue recovery and prosecution. She wanted the new girlfriend, who was an innocent person who had been lied to with the same fluency that Diana had been lied to have the information she deserved about who she was actually with. And she wanted Callum to face every single one of these consequences at the same time, simultaneously, without warning, with no opportunity to manage the sequence or control the narrative or disappear again before the walls came down completely. The coordination took 6 weeks. Diana's legal team worked with the insurance company's fraud division and with law enforcement and with a second attorney who handled the notification to the girlfriend through a careful and humane process that ensured she received the information with support rather than as a cold shock. Diana herself had no contact with Callum during this period. She passed him once in the neighborhood near his house. She had mapped his routine by that point, and she looked at him from her car, and he did not look at her because he did not know she existed in his world. And she drove past and felt nothing that she recognized as love or grief or longing. What she felt was the focused attention of someone in the final stage of a very long and very deliberate process. She said it felt like the last piece of a very large puzzle being held over the board before being placed. The satisfaction was not in placing it. The satisfaction was in knowing exactly where it went, and knowing that once it was placed the picture would be complete and could never be undone. On a Wednesday morning in the 6th week, the simultaneous notifications went out. Law enforcement arrived at Callum's workplace. The insurance company's fraud team filed with the court. The girlfriend received the documentation through her attorney. The death certificate that had been issued 7 years earlier was formally flagged for review. Callum's employer was notified of the active investigation. Every element of the constructed life he had built over 4 years began to collapse at the same moment from multiple directions, with no single point of collapse that he could address or contain or talk his way out of, because there was no singular conversation to be had. There was only the comprehensive and simultaneous arrival of the truth in every corner of the world he had built on the lie. Diana was not present for any of it. She was at work. She had taken a meeting she had scheduled specifically for that morning because she wanted to be somewhere ordinary and purposeful when it happened. She wanted to be in the middle of her own life, the life she had rebuilt without him, when the accountability arrived. She did not want to witness his collapse. She had spent 4 years witnessing her own, and that was more than enough. The legal proceedings took 14 months. Callum was charged with insurance fraud, identity fraud, and filing false documents. A combination of charges that carried significant exposure and that his attorney was unable to substantially reduce because the documentation Diana's team had assembled was, as the prosecutor later noted, more organized and more complete than most evidence packages prepared by professional investigators. He did not go to trial. He entered a plea. The insurance company pursued civil recovery of the fraudulent payout, plus interest plus legal costs. The girlfriend ended the relationship the same day she received the documentation and has, by all accounts, not looked back. Callum moved through the legal process without ever attempting to contact Diana directly, perhaps because his attorney advised against it, perhaps because he understood on some level that there was nothing he could say that would change anything. Perhaps because the particular cowardice that had led him to fake his own death rather than have an honest conversation was still fully intact, and was now directing him to stay silent in the face of consequences the way it had previously directed him. To stay silent in the face of responsibility. I spoke with Diana after all of it was resolved. I asked her what the 4 years between the funeral and the grocery store had actually done to her. Not what they had cost her, which was apparent and significant, but what they had done to her as a person, to the way she understood herself and what she was capable of. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think I used to believe that the worst thing that could happen to you would break you. I believed that because I had been broken before, smaller things, and I had felt how much it cost to put yourself back together. And when Callum died, when I thought he died, I felt something break that I genuinely did not know if I had the material to repair. And I repaired it, not because I am exceptional, because I had no other option available to me. You repair it, or you stop. And I was not going to stop." She paused. She said, "What finding him in that grocery store did was not break me again. It clarified something. It showed me that the grief I had felt was real, and the love was real, and the marriage was as real as anything I have ever lived. And that he is the only person in this story who was never real. Not once. Not for a single day of the 7 years we were together. That is the thing I had to find the framework for. Not his betrayal. The unreality of him. The fact that the person I grieved did not exist and never had. That is the work. That is the actual work. Everything else, the lawyer, the investigation, the charges, all of it, that was administration. The real work was deciding what to do with grief for someone who was never who you thought they were. Callum is serving a supervised sentence in the jurisdiction where the fraud charges were filed. The insurance company has recovered a portion of the fraudulent payout and continues to pursue the remainder through civil proceedings. Diana lives in the same city she moved to 4 years ago. She still has the dog. She still has the friends who never knew Callum and who treat her like a person rather than a tragedy. She has a life that she built entirely herself from the wreckage of a grief that turned out to be a lie, and she has built it with a precision and a completeness that belongs entirely to her. She did not forgive Callum. She has been asked about this by people who believe forgiveness is a necessary destination, and she addresses it with a patience that I find remarkable given the circumstances. She says, "Forgiveness is something you offer when there is a relationship worth preserving on the other side of it. There is no relationship. There is no other side. There is only my life, which is mine, and his consequences, which are his. Those two things are separate and complete, and neither one requires the other to be finished." She paused, and then she said, "I am not unfinished. I finished it. That is the whole story. Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight.